Well, thank you very much for that. It's a great privilege for me to be here. Let me say, first of all, that it's always an honor to speak directly after lunch. And there's the sort of sense that I'm sort of like telling bedtime stories and things. Those of you who need a nap, now would be a good time, and I won't be offended in the least. I wish very, very much that I had been here for this whole conference. That was my plan and my goal. But the reason that I wasn't is, in fact, in a certain sense, indicative of the problem we're here to discuss. May not only was the warmest May ever measured around the planet, the 363rd consecutive month that our planet has been temperature above the 20th century average. May was not only hot globally, in the United States, it was the wettest month that we've ever recorded. One of the things that happens when you raise the temperature of the Earth is that the atmosphere holds more water vapor than otherwise would, and you get torrential rain. Well, we had torrential rain across the states in May, and then on into June. And the flooding was so bad at the airports in New York that I was delayed a couple of days getting here, and I'm actually surprised that I got here at all. On the small part of the world where I live, the North American continent, which covers 4 or 5% of the Earth's surface, we see these kind of impacts now on a daily basis. So we've had horrific flooding. In California, our most populous state, we've had the worst drought ever recorded there. Along the great mountains of the North American West, the snowpack this year has all but disappeared, the snowpack that waters the land below. We've had, in the last few years, record heat to the extent that across the most fertile land on the face of the earth, the great grain belt of the United States, it's been almost impossible some years to grow corn in the ways that we're used to. None of this comes as a surprise to scientists or indeed to any of you. The only surprise, really, is the speed with which these changes are starting to appear. When I wrote the first book about climate change 25 years ago, we knew that a problem was headed our way. We knew that when you burned coal and gas and oil, you put carbon into the atmosphere. We knew its molecular structure trapped heat. We knew eventually is very different from right now in our lifetimes. If 25 years ago, anyone had told even the leading scientists working on this issue that by this point we would have lost most of the summer sea ice in the Arctic, people would have said, scientists would have said, no, that's still 50 or 75 years in the future. If anyone had said 25 years ago that the oceans would be radically changed, their chemistry profoundly shifted, scientists, even the best scientists, would have looked at them blankly. 25 years ago, it hadn't really occurred to us to bother measuring the pH of the oceans because they seemed much too large to fundamentally affect. But the chemistry of seawater changes as it absorbs carbon from the atmosphere. The oceans are 30% more acidic than they were 40 years ago. Think about what that means on an ocean planet to be fundamentally altering the chemistry of the seas. Think in general about the scale of what we're doing. We're taking the biggest physical features on Earth, the kinds of things like the Arctic that you can see from space, and we are breaking them one after another. We learned just this time last year that new measurements of the movement of the great glaciers on the West Antarctic ice sheet indicate that it's now effectively destabilized, undercut from beneath by enough warm water that its slow motion slide into the ocean is, at this point, seems, in parts of it anyway, inevitable. Even for those of us who were fully convinced we had a serious problem, that was a kick in the gut. because it happened again much faster than we thought. The conventional wisdom for a long time had been that the Antarctic was stable, at least on century timescales. There was just too much ice to melt. But the amount of extra energy that we're introducing into the Earth's atmosphere is large. We've only raised the temperature 1 degree, which doesn't sound like that much, but the Earth is a big place. The extra heat equivalent is the equivalent of about 400,000 Hiroshima-sized explosions daily, the heat equivalent. You can tell how much it is when you look at something like the Arctic, where there was millennia-old ice meters thick, and now it's gone. Think how much energy it takes to do that. And the bad news is not what I've told you. The bad news is we're still very near the beginning of this planetary dislocation. We've raised the temperature 1 degree so far, but the same scientists who told us that that would happen now predict with some confidence that we're on track to raise the temperature something like 4 degrees over the course of the... If that happens, then we cannot have civilizations like the ones we are used to having. We simply won't be able to grow food on the scale that's required. Our coastal cities will be inundated. The kind of things that we're already seeing in the places most badly affected. And I was so sorry to miss this morning the word from Bangladesh, a place where I've gotten to spend a fair amount of time. Those places will be every place. And that experience, now reserved for the most vulnerable people on Earth, will be experience of all the people on Earth. And there's no longer any, let me make 3 small points. 1, there's no longer any excuse for anybody not knowing this. If there was, then it ended last week when the most prominent person on the planet, the most recognized person on the face of the earth, Pope Francis, delivered an encyclical that I hope all of you will take the time to read. Though I am not Catholic myself, it is I'm Methodist. That's the most boring religion on earth, but we do what we can. We're very methodical. This encyclical is an astonishing document, both in its scientific observation, but also in its social, economic, spiritual, and moral description of the world we now inhabit. Second thing to be said is, it is not necessary for us to go down this path. 25 years ago, when we looked out at the future, it was difficult for us to see how we were going to avoid it because we didn't have the alternatives that we needed. 25 years ago, solar power and wind power and things were still things that we talked about with our fingers crossed. Is that something you do in Ireland? We didn't quite believe that they weren't really ready for prime time. That has changed. The most important, giving you a bunch of depressing statistics, the most important optimistic statistic on the planet is that in the last 6 years, the price of solar panels fallen about 75%. Okay? That is a huge destabilizing factor in all the right ways. It means that we're suddenly at the moment when between sun and wind and tide, we could power the world without wrecking the world. And so the question becomes, why aren't we doing it with any real power? Why aren't we moving the way that we moved on the eve, say, of World War II to make sure that we were in place to meet these challenges, that we were transforming our industrial sector to transform the planet. Why are we making so little progress? My country is probably the best example of that lack of progress. Despite 25 years of warnings, scientific warnings, we've basically had a bipartisan policy in Washington of doing nothing at all. And it's been entirely successful. Nothing has happened. From what I gather, Ireland is not entirely distant from that in its own approach to this problem. And the reason for that, in the States, but in many, many other places where I've been, too, is at this point pretty darn clear. Yes, there are things that make it difficult for us to react. Humans don't react to long-term threats as well as short-term ones. And, you can talk about psychology and theology and a million other things. The basic problem is the power of vested interest to keep us doing what we're doing is enormous. Those are many different vested interests. In this country, some of them say, are agricultural. Around the world, more than anything else, it is the power of the fossil fuel industry to keep us from changing. This is the most irresponsible industry on the planet that we've ever seen because the stakes are so high. What do I mean? Well, let's think of one of the theoretically good or sort of better examples of the fossil fuel industry. Because, in the US, we have many of the biggest oil companies, and they're completely unapologetic about wrecking the planet. ExxonMobil, the biggest oil company of all, can't be bothered to barely even acknowledge the existence of the problem that it is helping cause. But when you get to Europe, because Europeans are nicer people, they try a little harder. So Royal Dutch Shell, for instance, makes some of the right noises when they have shareholder meetings. And they, if you go to their website, there's plenty of pictures of penguins and, whatever else. But in practice, what happens? Last week, thousands of our colleagues in Seattle, in the United States, were in kayaks trying to block the movement of this enormous drilling rig up to the Arctic Ocean, where they're going to prospect for oil. Think about that for a minute. Having watched, as scientists said would happen, the combustion of fossil fuel melt the Arctic Ocean, Shell did not think to itself, maybe this is a reason we should become a solar power company, No, they looked at those melted waters and said, hey, this would make it easier for us to drill for yet more oil up there to keep this cycle going. When 100 years from now, with any luck, people look up irresponsibility in the dictionary, there'll be a little Shell logo right next to the name. And the same with BP and the same with everybody else, okay? The stakes, this is by far the largest thing that human beings have ever done, by far the largest. And so what we have to do is figure out how to overcome that astonishing power of vested interest. As you can tell from listening to me, I'm not a speaker, an activist, an organizer by, temperament, and certainly not by trade. That's the work of our brother from Friends of the Earth, or my colleagues from 350 in Ireland, or so on and so forth. People who really are. I'm a writer by inclination. Okay. Sort of the opposite of an organizer. I mean, it's nice to be here with you all, but left to my own devices, I'd rather be home typing. That's what I do. But at some point in the last little while, it got through even my thick head that writing another book on this issue was not really going to move the needle. Books are important. Conferences are important. What's really important in the end is organizing so that we have some way to stand up to that vested interest. If their strength is money, and the fossil fuel industry is by far the richest enterprise in human history, we're never going to match them that way. Our strength has to be in a different currency. Okay? It has to be in the currencies of movements, of passion, spirit, creativity. Sometimes we've got to be willing, I think, to spend our bodies. And so that's what I really want to talk about today. Because I'll just tell you stories, a couple of stories really, just to give you some sense of how it is that we might do this kind of work. When we started 350.org 8 years ago now, it was myself and 7 college students, and we had no money and no lists and no whatever. So it was preposterous for us to think that we were going to go out and organize the world. But we thought that. That's one of the reasons why we have this slightly odd name that we do. 350 is the most important number in the world. It's how much carbon you could safely have in the atmosphere, 350 parts per million, a number we're already well north of. We went past 400 this year and are continuing to go up about 2 parts per million per year. That's why the Arctic is melting. Okay, so it's probably the most important number in the world. But we chose it as our name because when we thought about what would be the problem with organizing the world, the first thing we ran up against was the fact that everyone around the planet insists on speaking their own language, and that makes it difficult. Arabic numerals, however, trip lightly over those linguistic boundaries, 350 means the same thing in Minute and in Mongolia, so that's good. When we started, as I said, there were 7 college students, and there are 7 continents, so each one took one. The guy that had the Antarctic also had to do the internet, okay? And so we set out to work, and our work was just to find other people like ourselves around the world. Now, not everywhere in the world is there someone who calls himself an environmentalist, but everywhere in the world. There's someone who's working on public health, on development, on war and peace, on hunger, on women's rights, on the things that you cannot have on a disintegrating planet. And those were the people who were our natural allies right from the start. We just said to people, let's take a day. This would have been by now the fall of 2009, so right after we started. Let's take a day and try to take this number, 350, and drive it into the information bloodstream of the planet, okay? Let people know about it. Do some education around this most important of issues. And we didn't know how well it would work. No one ever really tried anything like this, but we got the sense. We told everybody to do this on a Saturday all over the world. We got a sense it might work on the Thursday before. We were sitting around our little office. We had one office, we had a table that size, the 8 of us sitting around it, working on our laptops, putting out press releases and things. And the phone rang, and it was our leader in Ethiopia. And like all of us, she was a volunteer, and like many of us, she was a she. And like a surprisingly large number of us, she was 17 years old, okay? And she was in tears, and she said, the government's taken away our permit for this march we were going to do on Saturday. So we're doing it today before they can stop us, which was brave, but that wasn't why she was crying. She just kept saying, we wanted to do this the same day as everybody else. We wanted to be part of this whole thing all over the world. We're so sorry. We hope we're not spoiling it for everybody. We're just so sorry. And then she said, and we have 15,000 young people out in the street in Addis Ababa chanting 350. So I was like, wow, don't worry about the date. It's okay. And in fact, it was okay. That first weekend, there were 5,200 demonstrations around the world in 181 countries. CNN called it the most widespread day of political activity in the planet's history. And I'm going to show you just a few pictures, mostly because what I want you to see are what your brothers and sisters in this fight look like, okay? Who they are, so that you understand that you are not alone in this. The other thing you need to understand, one of the things I'd always heard was that environmentalism was something that rich white people did. And if you worried where your next meal was coming from, you wouldn't be an environmentalist, and so on and so forth. It took about, these pictures that first weekend, there were 5,200 demonstrations. So people were uploading pictures at the rate of 20 and 30 a minute at times from around the world. And it took just a few minutes of watching those to realize that that was nonsense. That most of the people we were working with around the world were poor, black, brown, Asian, young, because that's what most of the world is composed of. And oddly enough, they were exactly as concerned about the future as anybody else, maybe more so because if you're in some of those places, the future bears down hard on you. All around the world, enormous creativity brought to bear, people figuring out how to make the point in all kinds of ways. But also for the first time, tremendous religious involvement in this issue. Now that the Pope has spoken and that we're beginning to see the emergence of a religious environmental movement, it's hard to remember that even a few years ago this was a very novel thing that, liberal churches thought that environmentalism was something you got to after you took care of poverty and war, and that conservative churches thought it was a way station on the road to paganism, That's changed now. But there's like the head of Muslim South Africa, the head of indigenous traditions and things. Behind them, Desmond Tutu's successor is Anglican Archbishop at the head of a big multi-faith march. There in America is our most important evangelical college, where Billy Graham went to school. I'd been to that year off to the Middle East to do some organizing. It's a hard place to get around with all the military checkpoints and things in the way. I'd been to Bethlehem. People wanted to do something because the Dead Sea has been shrinking very rapidly as temperatures rise, but there were too many armies in the way. So the Jordanians said, well, we'll make the big 3 on our beach. The Palestinians said, we'll do the 5 in Palestine. The Israelis said, okay, we'll do the 0 on our shore. It was a beautiful day. 300 big demonstrations across China. Important place to be doing this work. Not an easy place. Like 1 or 2 of them got broken up by the police, but mostly they went ahead. China is fascinating. It's doing it's done a number of things that were not very smart, and it's done a number of things that were incredibly wise indeed. There's no country on earth that's doing more with renewable energy. Those are our brothers and sisters in the Maldive Islands. Maldives are more or less paradise. 1,200 islands spread about 1,000 miles across the equator in the Indian Ocean, white sand beaches, palm trees. The fly in this ointment is that the highest point in that nation is 1.5 meters or so above sea level, which is not a good place to be on a rapidly heating planet. That culture stretches back uninterrupted for 5,000 years. The odds of it getting to 5,100 are pretty small, but they are trying hard. Until their recent military coup, they were doing amazing work around these issues. That's the Student Government Association of the Maldives meeting in the lagoon to make their point. This was the biggest story at the time on Google News for about 36 hours. More people linking to it than any, and I think it was because people just didn't look the way that environmentalists were supposed to look. There's Yemen, which is as tough a place as there is on the world, All the women in that, making that 0 are in full black burqa. So to us, they don't look like the local Friends of the Earth chapter, okay? But their hearts are in exactly the same place. They're thinking not about themselves, but about the future, about other people. It was beautiful to see. There were 400 or 500 pictures that ended up in a file marked 350 adorable. And they were adorable. And they were also hard to look at. And chances are those girls may be refugees in the course of their lives, and not from anything they did, okay? So we've gone on doing this kind of work all over the world. We've now, by whatever count people say we've done about 20,000 of these demonstrations in every country on earth except North Korea. And it's been great fun, and we've been, been very useful to take this message to all kinds of places, places I'd never heard of before, places I'd heard of but for other reasons, every continent, every corner of the planet, and doing it in as creative ways as we could think of. We had one day a couple of years ago when they described as the largest art project in the planet's history. That was Tom York from Radiohead assembled 3,000 or 4,000 of his closest friends at Brighton there and gave them blue raincoats. And that's the image, for those of you with a good classical education, of King Canute trying to hold back the rising seas, okay? There were lots of these around the world that day that were quite amazing. That might have been the most beautiful of all. That's in the desert southwest in the United States, where we're in the midst now of a drought unlike any that's been recorded there in the past. And when the satellite came over, 3,000 or 4,000 people just whipped blue blankets up overhead to bring back that river to life for a minute. So a beautiful thing. This kind of work's very important, this kind of educational work. If we had 50 years to deal with this problem, this is exactly what we would do, over and over and over again. Human beings work best if they solve problems somewhat gradually and slowly, and with the least kind of wrenching impact. Our problem is we don't have 50 years. If we wanted to solve this problem, we had to start 25 years ago, and we didn't. We're way behind now. And so along with education, we need more than that. And in the last few years, we've increasingly, again, sort of despite our nature, or my nature anyway, found ourselves more and more engaged in, along with education, with some confrontation too, okay? Trying to slow down this out-of-control juggernaut. These are slides, a few pictures from, in some ways, the kind of start of this counteroffensive against the fossil fuel industry, trying to keep them from expanding into the last huge remaining pools of carbon around the world. In North America, above all, that may mean the tar sands in Canada, this vast pool of oily sand in Alberta, that if alone was tapped would be enough to destabilize the planet's climate. And so we decided we'd try and stop this pipeline down out of the tar sands to the Gulf of Mexico. It was called the Keystone Pipeline. Every pipeline that there's ever been proposed in the U.S. has been approved, or at least it has been up until this. Beginning in 2011, we had what was the largest civil disobedience action about anything in 30 years in the United States. 1,200 people went to jail over the course of a week or two, and then this spread around the world, and then back to the White House that fall, and thousands. By the time we were done in the fall of 2011, President Obama said, maybe we'll postpone a decision on this pipeline till after the next election. And that was okay. And he did. And then he postponed it for yet another election because we kept the heat on and kept marching and kept doing all these things. So far, we don't have a decision, which is good. It means 800,000 barrels of the dirtiest oil a day on Earth a day have stayed underground, okay? The better news is that it's begun to destabilize the financing for this kind of thing. They've started to pull out tens of billions of dollars from expansion plans up there in the tar sands, which is what we hope for. The even better news is that it now means that nowhere around the world, any place that someone is proposing a new pipeline, a new coal port, a new fracking well, people are rising up in huge and effective opposition to make it happen, all right? all of a sudden there is this fossil fuel resistance around the world, and it is really starting to bite in. We're beginning to win big victories. The Keystone Pipeline. I don't think that the Keystone Pipeline will be built. I also don't think that they're going to go ahead and build the biggest coal mine in the world in the Galilee Basin in Australia. People have been fighting that. Our colleagues there and many, many others around the world have been fighting it with great ferocity and passion. And among other things, they've managed to get virtually every bank in the world to say that they won't provide the financing necessary to do it. Fracking now has been banned in Scotland. It's been banned in New York State. It's been banned in France and in Quebec, and on and on and on. This is a good, powerful moment. But it's also, to a certain degree, playing defense all the time, okay? And trust me, these guys have an infinite number of these projects that they can come up with, and after a little while, it's like the Dutch boy trying to put his fingers in the dike. You sort of run out of fingers. And so we also try hard to play offense now, to take this fight to the powers that be, usually the fossil fuel industry. That's why this divestment movement's been so important as it's risen up around the world in the last few years. It was based on the proposition that fossil fuel companies now are no longer normal companies. They're not a normal part of our economic life. If you add up the carbon in the reserves of the world's fossil fuel companies, it comes to roughly 5 times as much as we can safely burn and stay below the 2-degree limit that you've heard about this morning from Jean-Pascal, from others, okay? The one line the world has ever drawn is this line that says we're going to try and keep temperature increases below 2 degrees. Well, if we follow the business plan of the fossil fuel industry, we will go way past that. There's no doubt about it. There's no mystery about it. There's no drama about it. If they do what they have told shareholders, banks, others they will do, then the planet will break. And that's why we've said, just as 25 or 30 years ago when the issue was apartheid in South Africa, that's why we've said this is one of these cases where it is necessary to break links with these companies in order to put the most pressure on them that's possible, to turn them into the pariahs that they must become. And in fact, it was Desmond Tutu, the great hero of that South Africa fight, who was one of the ones that sounded this call in the first place. When we started it, we thought, well, we're going to do this, but maybe this is too hard, maybe this is too radical, maybe it'll just be too much. We've been amazed to watch what happened. Started with sort of universities in the States, where we started at places like Stanford that began divesting, but spread quickly down to the Antipodes and then to Europe. And among universities and things, it's been amazing to watch even in the last few weeks as places like Oxford have begun to divest. The University of Hawaii, MIT is just about to do that. I mean, it's amazing to see that start to happen. It's been amazing to see it spread into religious communities. The World Council of Churches, Anglican dioceses around the world, the Unitarians, the United Church of Christ, now great Catholic institutions, the University of Dayton, and last month Georgetown in the United States. With the advent of the Pope's encyclical, I think it becomes incredibly difficult for Catholic institutions of any kind to imagine maintaining investments in this industry. I was so pleased to hear the news that Minute has announced that it will not be investing in the future in fossil fuel. That is a powerful, powerful moment, and one that I hope spreads very quickly across Ireland. Thank you so much for that really important work. And here's the deep thing. It's not just nuts like us that are doing this, okay? Not just crazy religious people, wacko environmentalists, whatever else. Last month, AXA, the largest insurance carrier in France, announced that it was pulling all its investments out of coal. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, the single biggest pool of money in the world, announced that it was doing the same thing. Really, the moment when I knew that this campaign was going to win, in a sense, was last September, and it was on the day of the great climate march in New York, a day when there were 1,000 people marching in Ireland, yes, at Stephen's Cross, yes, and that night, uptown in Manhattan, at the Cathedral of St. John, the representatives of the Rockefeller family stood up and announced that they were divesting all their philanthropies from fossil fuel. Now, if you think about that, John D. Rockefeller was the first great oil man. This was the first great fossil fuel fortune. That they said it's no longer financially prudent nor morally possible for us to continue with these investments. That was an important moment. It was the moment at the sort of beginning of the end of the fossil fuel age, okay? The question is how quickly we can make that age come to an end. Whether it drags on for a few more decades and hence drags down the planet, or whether we can make it happen with quick, rapid work. It's not just fossil fuel. It's, as you know, in this country, we need agricultural transformation as well. And it's not just coal and gas and oil. We can't be burning, biomass like peat. All of this stuff is carbon. Carbon has to stay in the ground where God put it. And instead, we have to, we have to have a clue, it's hard to go find coal and gas and oil and all that work to bring it up. Walk outside today, there's this insane solar spill going on out there, and it's all just going to waste, What Ireland's done with wind is impressive. What it can do with sun going forward, especially once there's a price for solar into the system, it will be remarkable too. The Germans are some days this summer generating 80% of their power from the sun, and Germany's just as foggy and misty as Ireland ever was, I can show you pictures all day because, as I say, we do this kind of work a lot. That top red balloon is where the Dead Sea was 40 years ago, by the way. Those are the people in Pakistan where they had the biggest flood since Noah in 2010, okay? 20 million people moved out of their homes by the flood in the Indus River. But I want to show you just one last set of pictures of the kind of resistance that's rising up everywhere around the world. That's the big climate march in New York. 400,000 people last fall, the most people that have marched about anything in the United States for a very long time. It was a beautiful day. But that same day, people all over the world. And the pictures that for me were the most beautiful of all came from are they not here? Maybe they are. Yes, they are. Came from our brothers and sisters in the Pacific. One of those island nations that probably aren't going to be there, may well not be there by century's end. Vanuatu, Tuvalu, beautiful nations with thousands and thousands of years of human history. And where we have lots and lots of friends who do amazing work. They built big, in each island, they cut down a tree and built an indigenous canoe, a traditional canoe. Some places they hadn't done it for 50 or 100 years, but there are enough old people left who knew how, that each island produced one of these canoes. And then they took them off to the biggest coal port in the world, which is in Newcastle in Australia. And they used them for a day to blockade the largest coal ships in the world to keep them from getting out of the harbor. And it was a beautiful, symbolic moment. And it really helped. It was a few months later that voters in Queensland turned out the government in that province that wants to build that enormous coal mine in the Galilee Basin. The opposition everywhere is building, and it's building from beautiful, beautiful roots. Y'all are a part of that fight. We need you to be a big part of it. We need you to turn up the speed, turn up the volume, make it happen fast. I'll close just by, since I'm looking around, one of the things that's great about this room is that we have great diversity, especially in age, and we've got wonderful young people who are really leading this fight all over the world. But then we got a few people with hair like mine too, and I want you all to know that you're just as, when we were doing that civil disobedience in Washington, I wrote the letter asking people to come to Washington and get arrested in large numbers, which is not an easy kind of letter to write, okay? And one of the things I said in it was, I didn't want young people to have to be the cannon fodder here, okay? At least in the States right now, in our economy, if you're 22, maybe the single best thing for your resume is not an arrest record, okay, on it. On the other hand, one of the unmixed blessings of growing older is, past a certain point, what the hell are they going to do to you, and so it was with pleasure that we watched people we didn't ask people, how old are you when we were getting arrested, that'd be rude, but we did cleverly, I think, say, who was president when you were born, okay? And the two biggest cohorts came from the FDR and the Truman administrations, okay? So that was really good to see. And one of the reasons that it was really good was that there were a lot of young people there, and they got to see their elders acting the way elders are supposed to act in a working society, okay? The Pope last week demonstrated to us how spiritual leaders are supposed to act and think. Not with half measures, not by saying on the one hand, on the other hand, just by saying, here's where we are and here's what has to be done. And the rest of us in this movement need to be doing the same kind of thing. I cannot guarantee to you that we will win. This is why I'm not a great organizer, okay? I'm a writer in the end, and so I'm forced to be honest as much as I can. We can't guarantee we're going to win. We're up against the richest people on earth, and we waited a long time to get started. There are scientists who think we waited too long. That the momentum of this heating is out of control. The best science indicates we have a narrow window left with which to affect the future, but narrow and closing. And so we have to work very hard. We can't guarantee that we will win, but I can guarantee, because I've been all over the world these last years, I can guarantee that there will be a fight. And it's a great pleasure just to get to stand shoulder to shoulder with you all in that fight. Thank you very much.